Look at that.
I think there's someone out there.
There's nobody out there.
You're crazy.
Yeah, right. Look, right there.
I don't see anyone.
Oh yeah, I see you. What? I'm on a desktop.
What? Really?
The virus protection's on.
No, what?
No, that's freaking me out.
Hey, welcome to iFanboy, the video podcast from the comic book discussion site iFanboy.com. I'm Connor. I'm here with
Ron.
I'm Josh.
And today on our show, we're going to get a little a little deep in a concept in making comics.
You didn't say we were going to get deep.
We're getting deep, so bear with you. So for those of you who might be fans of film or TV or something, there's a concept called the fourth wall. And what that means is that it's a postmodern kind of concept of storytelling where you involve the audience. And the name comes from the idea in like TV or movies, you see three walls and the fourth wall is the camera. And quite often you see instances where the characters talk to the camera, talk to the audience. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is an example of this, where Ferris would address the audience, tell them what's going on. The Muppets did it all the time, where they kind of looked into the camera and talked about it. This isn't a concept that's new to comics. In fact, I believe comics are one of the trendsetters in this idea of breaking the fourth wall. As for the past 40 years, there have been instances of comics where they've involved the audience in the storytelling factor. We were sitting around talking about comics, and I kind of realized I saw this thread in this concept of breaking the fourth wall, and said, let's take a look at it, and realize that there was just stacks and stacks and stacks of comics that did this. So I thought I'd take some time and go over them and kind of highlight some of our favorites. I'm sure we're not going to touch on every one that's out there, but at least the ones that we think are the most interesting and the most important. So really, the concept of breaking the fourth wall in comics started with Marvel Comics in the 60s. In the early 60s,
To the best of our knowledge.
Yes, exactly.
We weren't there.
In the early 60s, in the comic scene, there was DC Comics and Marvel Comics. And what separated the two, and I'm sure everybody's heard all this, but I'll mention again, is that Marvel Comics set their heroes in the real world. They put them in Manhattan, in New York.
As opposed to DC, where they were in Metropolis.
Yeah, or Gotham. Yeah, or Star City.
All New York, really.
Yeah. But so what happened was that we had the characters interacting with us, in our world. The president was Kennedy at the time in the early 60s. It wasn't some fictional president like they do in DC a lot. And Fantastic Four was the kind of the first modern Marvel Comics title, and it was also the kind of trendsetter in this concept of breaking the fourth wall. Fantastic Four number 10 actually featured Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the creators, in the issue. On the cover. Yeah. Like the cover, it was one of those great classic kind of Silver Age covers where they told you what's happening in the book, and like Mr. Fantastic was all angry. And in the bottom left-hand corner, they say, and for the first time, meet the creators of the Fantastic Four, Stan and Jack. And there's two guys kind of in suits. You see them with their backs to the camera, and they're talking about how good the cover looks.
Right.
And what they did was they introduced Marvel Comics as an entity in the Marvel Universe. So it was almost that they became aware of the fact that there were people making comics about these heroes in this universe, in the comics that we're reading about them. It gets kind of mind-blowing.
It hurts.
They took it to the point where, and they kind of did it because at the time Stan Lee was building this kind of cult of Marvel. He had created the bullpen.
Well, the way of differentiating from DC was to make you feel like you were part of the club.
Right.
So if the comic book talked to you and addressed you directly, then you felt like you were sort of involved.
And you knew the people doing it.
Yeah, whereas DC,
and more recently Dan DiDio is also picked up, I think, a lot.
Right, but what was interesting was that because now Quesada and DiDio can do that at conventions or through the internet, they didn't have that, so all they had was the comics as the form, as the thing. So what Marvel did was they grew the letters page, so they took a lot of letters from fans and answered them, and they created a cult of their personality, and they took it that one step further by actually putting themselves into the comics. There were several issues of Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and Daredevil and things like that where the creators existed. You never saw their faces. It was always kind of silhouetted or they were changed. The most famous example, and actually this was recounted in Alex Ross and Kurt Busiek's Marvel's recounted.
Yeah.
Not
recounted would be the
recounted, is at the wedding of Sue Storm and Reed Richards of Fantastic Four, there's a panel where Stan and Jack are trying to get into the church and they get turned away. And it's the irony, like, we created these people, can't we go to their wedding? But they can't. They actually put that into Marvel's as well.
It's either trend-setting or self-indulgent.
That's the thing.
It's a fine line to walk.
And now, in the early Marvel standpoint, I think it was a little more self-indulgent, kind of jokey.
Yeah.
But it kind of paved the way to evolve it as a story point. So what happened was that Marvel still kind of played with this concept through the 60s and 70s. And the example in the 70s that I remember the most fondly was actually in the pages of Nova. Which is a series, a 70s series. We have here the Essentials Nova Volume 1. In Nova number 5, it's 5 issues after Richard Rider gets his powers as Nova, and he's gone through the origin, kind of, okay, I know what I can do. He's this kid on Long Island, and of course, the Spider-Man model, I want to make money. So he flies into Manhattan and goes to Marvel Comics and says, hey, make a comic about me. And he meets Marv Wolfman, and
who's the writer of the book.
The writer of the book. And Marv Wolfman goes, but who are you? I never heard of you. So Nova goes out to try to make a name for himself, and then he comes back, and Marv Wolfman goes, okay, you're enough of a name. Let's go talk to Stan. And they go into Stan Lee's office, and they pitch Stan on the book, and Stan passes. And so it's this.
But there was a book.
Exactly. So
Pretty silly.
So it's this idea of the world inside the world, and the idea of breaking away between the characters and their creators is really what the audience feels they're involved, but then making the characters aware of the fact that the creators exist is a theme that gets further explored into the 80s. And one of the kind of neat little things, and again, Marvel is paving the way on doing this. In the early mid-'80s, they did something called Assistant Editors Month, kind of a gimmick before the gimmick period, where the assistant editors took over the books and edited for a month.
I think they'd like to forget that period.
Yeah, I think they would. But they were actually, this is under the Jim Shooter regime at Marvel, and some of those books were really kind of funny, but they were also very fourth wall breaking, postmodern, kind of self-aware, like the Avengers go on the Letterman show. And it's a famous cover. You see Letterman on the cover, kind of addressing the audience, introducing the Avengers, and they almost made the characters aware of the fact that this month was a wacky month because the assistant editors were taking over. And it was this, again, kind of this pulling behind the curtain of how comics are made.
That stuff would never fly now. It's interesting because comics were almost different back then, where you could take chances, be wackier.
Yeah.
I think if you had a whole month now where things just went goofy, people would lose it.
The last example of that was when Marvel did the Nuff Said month. When there were they did all silent issues. But that was not wacky though. That was more.
But they could carry on their current storylines doing that. Yeah. Where if to do something like that, then,
it's plucking out of the.
And
people would lose their.
What trade would you put that in? It doesn't fit.
So I come up with this genius idea for the Netflix thing. I mean, it was pee your pants funny. I was just watching it because I already shot it, and then I was watching it on my computer, and I almost peed my pants. I tell the guys about it, and they're like, actually, we're going a different direction. Do something about breaking the fourth wall. What? That's not funny. Who wants to hear me say, head over to netflix.com/iFanboy, and you get a 2-week free trial with no late fees and no delivery fees. It's some breaking the fourth wall concept. I don't even know what that means.
But so luckily, this concept of breaking the fourth wall evolved and got way more mature and way more almost elegant in its execution.
It became more philosophical than it did goofy.
Exactly. And one of the best examples actually finally came from DC, the DC side of the fence, in one of our favorite books, Animal Man.
Yeah, this one. Whereas in the Marvel stuff that you're talking about, it was almost like. It wasn't talking about the metaphysical idea of that there's somebody watching me. It was more like, we're just going to place these characters in the world. Yeah. And by putting themselves in it, they're saying that they live in the same world as you do, theoretically. Whereas Animal Man is basically, there's 3 volumes. I'm not sure how many issues there was. There's 3 trades, which is how you get it now. Where the character slowly becomes aware that he is a comic book character being written by a guy whose name is Grant Morrison. Yeah. And it's sort of...
and being watched by thousands of people all the time.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's creepy.
It's this idea of self-awareness.
Yeah, but it's totally different from the Marvel style in that, slowly as you read this, it starts to... for me, was creep me out. I mean, the moment in the book where he realizes and turns to you and says, "Ah!"
Yeah.
I was like, "Ah!" It was like one of those...
I mean, it's not like a huge secret because if you look at the cover of the 3rd book, even a 2nd book, I mean,
he's being unraveled by a hand.
That's Brian Ball's hand supposedly.
Right.
And then there's Grant Morrison on the cover, and he's but it's about the journey that the guy goes through. And it's funny because the whole time he does this, he's still in the DC universe proper.
He's still fighting the good fight or whatever he's doing.
But he's finding out about his character, and it's sort of comments on rebooting and you know, like how the timeline in the past doesn't make any sense.
But then it also reaches its nadir at the final issue of the series when he actually goes to Grant Morrison's house.
He goes face to face with this creator.
And then the whole like final issue is just him having a chat with Grant Morrison, which is like.
And it was really interesting because it was early in Grant Morrison's career. I mean, it was late 80s, early 90s, right?
Yeah, it started in 88, I believe.
Yeah, and so it was early in his career. Grant Morrison now has got a bit of a reputation as a writer for the kind of the wacky, kind of make your head hurt, kind of think about things, you know, that sort of thing. But and this really kind of started that, but in a way that was really, really smart.
Well, it was very clear. Like you could tell his idea was there from the beginning of the series.
Yeah.
The whole thing is a straight line through. It didn't ever. It was very focused, I believe, on the goal of getting to this point.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that it works really well, especially now, is that the art style, which if you were to look at it now, it looks of the
simple.
time.
Yeah.
And if you were to see this in a book now, they would get somebody on it who was very modern, maybe even like impressionistic, like it just had a certain style to it. But because this looked exactly like all the other superhero comics of the time, that effect actually makes it work better.
Yeah.
Because you're not expecting it out of that. Because the thing is, if you had seen, you know, like some sort of more painterly style where it's like realistic, then like I think
you
that's,
might expect it more than you would.
But they just chose straight up superhero. Chaz Trug.
Chaz Trug and Doug Hazelwood.
Doug Hazelwood's on Inks, I believe.
Okay. Mark Farmer too. Mark Farmer's good.
You know, it's a straight, like the art is not you know, it does a job. It's not stunning.
It's a mind blowing thing. I mean, I feel bad that we've revealed it because if you're reading the book through and don't know what's coming, it even blows your mind more.
But eventually, and we're actually going to talk more in depth about Animal Man, I think, on a future show.
So I call back. Hey, what about the GoDaddy promo? You know, we needed like 20 minutes ago. Well, if you needed it 20 minutes ago, you shouldn't have me change the idea, because then you would have had it 40 minutes ago and this wouldn't be a problem. So I start with the original idea, and I did the whole, you know, GoDaddy, head over to GoDaddy.com, enter the coupon code iFanboy, blah, 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 you know, save 10% on your purchases. I had all that already done. The more I even think about it, yes, you, Mr., Mrs., non-gender specific watcher person, how many times have you heard me say it? Like a billion? So is it really necessary? Don't you know that I'm just going to say, head over to GoDaddy.com? I always say it.
Another book from Marvel that was similar in that creator interacting with the character was She-Hulk.
Yes, Sensational She-Hulk, about the same time period, late 80s, early 90s, by John Byrne, another big name in comics. Took a more humoristic bent.
This was a comedic, like, She-Hulk argued with John Byrne about her story.
Well, the cover of the very first issue is She-Hulk standing there, word balloons, talking to you, the reader, on the cover, and that's how it started. That's you know, the precedent.
The concept was that She-Hulk was aware of the fact that she was a comic character. She was aware of the fact that John Byrne was writing her, and as Connor said, would get into arguments with him, be like, "Why am I doing this again?" You know, like this guy, and it was this very kind of awareness and interplay between the creator, not like in the Fantastic Four model where She-Hulk's actually looking at him, but she knows that there's somebody above her, kind of creating
It's sort of an argument with God type of thing. Even though it's comedic, it's still sort of philosophical.
You would suggest that John Byrne has some sort of a God complex?
I'm not touching that one.
I'm going to keep doing it little by little.
So
look up John Byrne. Maybe you know what we're talking about.
Maybe. He's got a message for it here. Anyway,
no comment.
So She-Hulk took a more, like we said, comedic bent because it kind of went for the kind of gags concept, but it got just kind of as deep at times, and it became this kind of questioning: why am I here? What am I doing? What are my motivations? Surprisingly, this concept kind of went away in the 90s.
But you can only do it so many times.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as people questioned the quality of the 90s, they kind of, waned a little.
But that was before the bad 90s anyway. That was early 90s.
Right, but I'm saying after She-Hulk and then after Animal Man in the bad 90s, we didn't see a lot of kind of heady...
There wasn't a lot to think about.
Concepts,
It was almost a reaction to that. Like, comics started going in that direction, and then everybody pushed back.
Back to action, back to art, and back to kind of wow.
Back to leg straps.
But now that we're back in the leg straps.
Well, actually, speaking of leg straps, in the 21st century, there's a character, another Marvel character named Deadpool, which has got leg straps.
Lots of guns.
Partially created by Rob Liefeld.
Little feet.
The character has been evolved through the 90s and early 2000s as having a bit of a he's called the Merc with a Mouth, where he's kind of running commentary, kind of snarky.
He's
character.
his own narrator.
Yeah, his own narrator. What's happened in recent runs is that Deadpool would speak directly to the audience. Almost as like he's aware that there's an audience, but not reacting, just kind of would turn to them and be like, you know, like, you know, would make a snarky quip or whatever, to the point where other characters in the stories would be like, who are you talking to? You know? And it became a very comedic device, but it involved you as the reader in the story, which was really kind of interesting because in Deadpool's origin, he's just a mercenary with lots of guns and the you know, the Rob Liefeld mask kind of character, and they evolved it into this kind of, you know, breaking the fourth wall kind of you know, postmodern character.
Is it Joe Kelly who?
Joe Kelly did a lot of work. Fabian Nicieza did a lot of work with it. A lot of writers have played with that concept.
Yeah, it's funny because, you know, the fourth wall. A lot of comics use it if they have narration. If the main character narrates the book, or you're getting into their head, then that's something. But that's sort of a very basic version of it. These are all books that sort of take it a step further, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of the narration, there's another book that we've talked on previous shows, stuff like that, Casanova, by Image Comics, written by Matt Fraction, where he'll break the fourth wall to help recap and bring the audience up to speed. So much so, actually, they've drawn in Eric Stevenson, who's the executive director at Image, to look directly at the audience and say, this person was in issue. It was almost as like the narrator box.
It's the asterisk, but it's a whole panel, and it's got him.
And they credit him, but it has the fact that he's the executive editor of Image has nothing to do with the story. It's just all of a sudden he's there as a recap, addressing the audience, saying, "Let me bring you up to speed." You know, which is a device, but it's kind of interesting in that postmodern kind of bent.
In case you didn't notice, with the you know, season coming up, I'm going to head over to jinx.com/iFanboy, and everyone, oh yeah, everyone, okay, well, everyone that I'm buying a gift for is getting an iFanboy t-shirt from this guy right here, because that's what I'm going to do for Christmas. I hear it's this year's Tickle Me Elmo. Do you get that? Is that, how old are you?
Most recently, there have been a couple of really interesting kind of spins on this concept. One that we were talking about earlier was the character of the Sentry. The Sentry was a Marvel character, and his origin almost had a postmodern bent of itself.
I mean, there was like a big hoax thing that Marvel tried to pull, where even in Wizard had printed that they found these lost pages from the Fantastic Four, and it was this character that Stan Lee had created that no one knew about. Right. And so that's what they started with, you know, and so and that's the character's idea. Like, everybody used to know him, but they don't now. Right. And then at that, you start to become aware that the Sentry knows, or there's some fact that he is in a comic book that matters to him. And then Bendis in the New Avengers took that a step further, and they went and had a conversation with Paul Jenkins.
Yeah, Paul Jenkins, who wrote the Sentry book that came out of the hoax.
In 2000, Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee did a beautiful book that was slightly confusing.
Slightly?
It came out right after their Inhumans run.
Yep.
And then the Sentry lay dormant for a little while because nobody knew what to do with him. And then he was in New Avengers, and then there was a miniseries after that. But so they go and they find Paul Jenkins, and
what happens is that the Sentry was meant to be like the Superman character that Marvel.
He's the power of a million exploding suns.
Exactly, and he has a yellow costume with an S and a cape. He's very much, but he's blonde, so he's very much the Superman of Malcolm.
And he's crazy.
But but he's crazy. He's schizophrenic. He's agoraphobic. He's got all these kind of every kind of things. And in the New Avengers, in the pages of the New Avengers, he basically his villain, who's is called the Void, is like a negative kind of representation.
He has lots of hair.
Yeah. It basically, there's a lot of destruction going on, and they isolate it down to this guy who claims he's the Sentry, that he's a superhero, and claims that he's friends with Iron Man, claims that he's friends with Reed Richards, and turns out his villain has erased everyone's memories, and that there's no memory of him. The only memory of a character named the Sentry in the Marvel Comics is a series of comics written by Paul Jenkins in the Marvel Universe called The Sentry. And so it becomes this really big circle, you know, and to the point of bringing Paul Jenkins into the comic, where they're in this cave, and Iron Man's like,
"Here's Paul Jenkins."
Yeah, here's Paul Jenkins, and he's like, "I wrote you." He's like, "You don't exist," you know. And so it becomes this idea of existence and what is existence, and if somebody writes you, does that make a character exist? And then when you introduce that concept of existing in the universe where the characters exist, does it exist? And it becomes this kind of.
Do you even know what you just said?
No, it hurts. It hurts my head. But so it was a really kind of interesting way, and it was a way to explain why the character was there, but again, carrying through the idea that Marvel Comics exists in the Marvel Universe and all that kind of deal. Most recently, though, and the book that kind of kicked off this whole show idea was a book published by DC Comics. It was a trade paperback called Dr. 13. And what it did was it was written by Brian Azzarello and drawn by Cliff Chiang. And
Up-and-coming artist Cliff Chiang.
Yes. And there were a bunch of short stories that were published in Tales of the Unexpected, which I had never even heard of.
No,
it was one of those.
I think it's the whole magic side of the DC world.
And what it was is that it was handed to me. The trade was handed to me by a friend of mine. He said, "You got to read this." I said, "Why?" He's like, "It's Animal Man, but for comics." And I said, and I just read Animal Man, and I was like, great. I'm like, but Animal Man is a comic. He's like, no, trust me, it's Animal Man for comics. I'm like, okay. So I start reading the story, and it's the story of this doctor who's like a kind of paranormal doctor, and he discovers this kind of caveman guy who turns out to be Anthro, which is an old 70s character. DC character.
Dr. 13 has been around since 1951.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He's an established. I mean, he's been around a long time. He showed up in the 70s, and like he's not a made-up character for this. That's important.
And what they did was, and Anthro wasn't a made-up character either, and it starts this journey, this really wacky journey that involves Spanish pirates on a flying pirate ship, a ghost Confederate soldier, a group of Nazi guerrillas, Nazi chimps that were lost into the wilderness. It's this wacky kind of trip that they take through the DC universe, which ultimately is exploring their existence. There's a little boy character who's kind of dressed up kind of like a childhood Superman kind of costume, who you get the sense has the answers. And the reason why we're bringing it up is because at the end of the book, there's a big fight where they're basically fighting for their existence, where this kind of overarching force has deemed that all these characters will no longer exist except for Dr. 13's daughter, that she's been accepted to exist in this new universe they're creating.
Because she's kind of hot.
Yeah, exactly. And what starts off as them fighting this big representation of Mount Rushmore evolves and morphs, and it's never exactly this, but it's strongly suggested that the four heads of Mount Rushmore morph to create the heads of Grant Morrison, Jeff Johns, Mark Waid, and Greg Rucka, who are the guys behind 52, who have been kind of
the architects of the DC universe.
Exactly, the architects of the new DC universe. And Dr. 13 is in this battle with the architects of the DC universe to fight for his existence in this universe. Blew me away when I turned the page. I was like, oh my God, look at that. And for a moment I thought, this is really inside. Like, how inside is this? How self-indulgent and navel-gazing is this?
That's what I thought.
Exactly.
And it wasn't for just a moment either. It was for the rest of it.
Yeah. But, furthermore, it was written by Brian Azzarello, who I don't really connect with the DC superhero proper kind of universe. So it hit me on a whole bunch of different levels.
The idea of it was interesting, that these little-known characters would be fighting for their life from being retconned out, but. It was an interesting idea.
Yeah. Yes.
In execution,
it maybe wasn't you're saying this much idea. Yeah. It was maybe this much idea.
Yes.
Okay.
Also, a little. It's on the self-indulgent scale. It's really.
It's really, really high. And that's why I was surprised that it saw print, and B, that it saw print in a collected edition.
Yeah.
And I've never heard of it. Yeah. I mean, like it just from out of nowhere.
I like the art.
The art's fantastic.
Yeah, the art is fantastic. Cliff Chiang, we've said it before, we're huge fans of Cliff Chiang. He recently he's on Green Arrow, Black Canary, which is awesome. The art is beautiful. I mean, at one point later on in the story, when after we see these heads in Mount Rushmore, then they become their own entities, and they each have masks of the characers they've been associated with.
Yeah, so you don't ever see their faces.
I was saying to Connor that in sort of a reverse on the fourth wall thing, I would hate to be Cliff Chiang. Because you have to draw these guys that you do want to work with.
Yeah, exactly.
And like that's just too much pressure.
So you've got Grant Morrison in a Batman mask, and you've got Mark Waid was in a Flash mask, and so
Jeff
it's like
Johns in a Superman mask.
Superman, and then and Rucka. What did Rucka have? I forget, look at it. I want to say Batman. No, was it a question or
Montoya?
Yeah, it was the long locks of hair. But I mean, all in all, the book itself I really enjoyed because it was a very postmodern kind of
Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman. Oh yeah. Oh, Wonder Woman. He still's not over that, is he?
No.
Anyway,
he never will be.
But it was a very fun kind of like trip behind the scenes of the DC universe. You know, and I identified with Anthro, identified Dr. 13. The other character is a vampire character who I thought was great. It was a well done story up until the point where it broke the fourth wall and kind of had that creator aspect. But even then, it stayed wacky and the art was good enough for me to enjoy it. I don't think it's the best thing in the world, but I was just surprised that they did something this kind of edgy. You know?
I just don't understand the point of it.
Yeah, that's the question.
Especially
That's
after Animal Man, like it didn't do anything.
Animal Man had a point.
Yeah.
It explored something specific. This is just kind of like poking fun at your bosses.
Yeah,
and
which is-
then printing it and
which
selling
is
it.
bizarre.
Put it in the company newsletter.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. So
I think we've also explored Pointless at this point. So
yeah, so if you have any questions about existence or metaphysics or your existence, you can email us at contact@ifanboy.com.
Letters
but
are
there's
gonna
probably a better website for that.
For smarter people with degrees.
Or you could call and leave a voicemail at 888-FANBOYS, which is 326-2697.
And you go to ifanboy.com. There's going to be a thread about this show, and you can go to revision3.com for the forums, the iFanboy forums. There'll be a discussion there. You can discuss more fourth wall stuff.
And I think somebody behind the camera is going to start rolling the credits, so we should probably say goodbye.
Do that.
Yeah.
I don't want to fix the light the whole time. Is that
And someone's got to turn their phone off.
It's not my phone.
That's not my phone. Who wants to do the opening intro?
I will.
All right, and we'll have
Should you
don't
do
do the
more of an
sponsors.
explainer about what the show is?
Yeah, I was planning on doing that. Yeah, on the top of the fan, I'm going to explain the concept in the movies and things like that. So.
Wait, what?